make you sign when time is up.
Okay. So hello everyone and welcome. So I'm here, the ambassador of the Swarm team. So I'm going to give you a update about what we've been up to and what happened during the past year since we met here last year. Oh, can you? So, but it's too big. Can we like do it full screen, like F11 or something?
Isn't it full screen?
So first, I would like to give a little introduction about what Swarm is. It started off as kind of the distributed, decentralized hard drive for the world computer that is Ethereum, but during the years, it has grown to be a little bit more than that. Primarily, it is still a peer-to-peer content address storage and delivery network. But it also comes with an incentive and payment layer. So if you're contributing resources, namely bandwidth and storage to the network, you can actually earn Ether with it. And also, it is providing real-time peer-to-peer messaging services for distributed applications. Well, and it's also silly acronym. So just so that we speak the same language, I would like to introduce the basic terminology that we use in Swarm: chunks, hashes, and manifests. So chunks are these at most 4 kilobyte bits of like chunks of data, which are the basic building blocks of the Merkleized data structures upon which Swarm depends. They can hold arbitrary data and metadata and other Swarm primitives. They are the only things that the network layer knows and cares about. So these chunks are the little bits of data that are being sent around the network. And their addresses live in the same address space as the nodes of the Swarm network. And chunks tend to be stored by and served by nodes that are closest to them in this address space. So this is a DHT, and there's a metric, a distance metric. So it's a valid question, and there's a number that answers this question, is how far this chunk is from this node. And of course, the closer it is, the more likely it is that you will find that chunk on that node. Hashes are the primary reference in the Swarm network. So that's how you reference stuff, by their hashes. So that's the basis of content addressing. These are binary Merkle tree hashes for individual chunks, which means that in addition to integrity protecting the whole chunk, they can also be used for proving to a smart contract that a particular piece of data is part of that chunk. And they are also used for Merkle tree representation of arbitrary data, not only for individual chunks, meaning that once you have the Swarm hash of any piece of data, then with a relatively small number of additional information, you can actually prove that some small amount of data is actually part of your large collection. They have the usual properties of cryptographic hashes, so they are collision-free. They can facilitate proofs of custody, and just like the chunk addresses, they also share the same address space. So you can talk about hashes of collections, you can talk about hashes of files, and you can talk about hashes of chunks, and they all come from the same address space, and they are the references that are used in Swarm, the primary references. There are other references that I'm going to talk about. So a hash of 128 chunks is a single hash. And if you take 128 of these hashes, they make up exactly a chunk. So if you have a whole bunch of chunks, then you have other chunks that hold hashes of these chunks, and you build this Merkle tree all the way up to a single root hash, and this is how you reference your entire collection of chunks. And the leaves of this tree hold the actual data, and the so-called intermediary chunks in between are the ones that are needed to both find and integrity protect that data. And eventually, if you work your way all the way up, you're going to end up with a single root hash. So because of this Merkle structure, random access to data is supported by design. So even if you have terabytes of data, you can both access it in a random fashion, so you can access any part of it, and in addition to that, you can prove with a relatively manageable witness size that that data is part of that big collection. So what are manifests? Manifests are the metadata holding containers for collections of any kind of objects. So they are a mapping between arbitrary access paths, basically strings, similar to URIs in web, in HTTP. And they contain also the metadata. So think, for example, of HTTP headers. And they are also Merkleized data structure, meaning that whatever you can find in them, you can also prove that it is there. And by proving, I mean present a small witness to a smart contract so that a smart contract can automatically decide on whether it is or it is not part of that data structure. So just to bring up some better known analogies. So these manifests, they work as an index. So they tell you where certain data can be found. They're like a directory tree as well. They are kind of like websites, so we call them swarm sites. So these are virtualized web servers for static content. So you have both the HTTP headers and the HTTP payload described by these manifests. So they are somewhat similar to htaccess files on traditional web servers. They are key value databases, and they also work like file system directories. So these are the kind of analogies that we can relate to when we're talking about swarm manifests. So what has happened in since last year's community conference? The encryption and access control that I have talked about, how it was going to be implemented, it has been implemented mostly along those lines. So now we have it and you can try it. We have PSS, which is the postal service over Swarm. It's a real-time messaging service for dApps. Real-time means that both the sender and the receiver needs to be online. But in addition to PSS, we also have Swarm feeds, which are the offline version of messaging. So this is a subscriber-publisher model where publishers are publishing whatever they need to publish, and subscribers can access that data even if the publisher happens to be offline, because the data is actually stored in Swarm. So PSS only uses the routing network of Swarm, but feeds use both the storage and the routing network, so you can actually publish mutable content on swarms. So it's a append-only kind of data structure. It doesn't have consensus because we're not trying to replicate the functionality of the blockchain. We have the blockchain for the consensus. But the swarm feeds are structured in such a way that any user, not only the publisher, but any user can basically checkpoint the swarm feed at any point to the blockchain and hook it up to a ENS resolver. And that way, any feed, even though the feeds in swarm themselves do not provide consensus, if consensus is needed, it can be readily built by sending the feed, the checkpoint of a feed to the blockchain. Access control in swarms, so this is the part with which I've been involved most closely. So again, because we have a decentralized system, access control works a little bit differently from how it works in a centralized system. References are twice as long as hashes because they consist of a ciphertext hash, so the hash of the ciphertext, plus a decryption key, a symmetric key for decryption. So in total, with 64 bytes, you can reference any encrypted content in Swarm, but the API is exactly the same as for the unencrypted content, with the sole exception that the references, instead of the 32-byte hash, are now these 64-byte encrypted references. Otherwise, the entire API remains the same, and this is evidenced by the fact that we haven't changed any of the example applications. They just worked with the encrypted content now. So the API remained the same. The only cryptographic assumption upon which Swarm content encryption relies is the security of SHA-3. It's the same SHA-3 version upon which Ethereum itself depends, meaning that as long as SHA-3 is secure, you can trust that the encryption of Swarm content is also cryptographically secure. And if it is not secure anymore, so if SHA-3 gets broken, then we will have much bigger problems than that, because that breaks Ethereum. So we did not, the takeaway lesson here is that we did not introduce any additional security assumptions beyond those upon which Ethereum already depends. Access control. So basically, read access means that those who have read access have the ability to decrypt. This is very different from centralized systems where read access basically meant the ability to retrieve, because the gatekeepers would not give you the content unless you have read permission. So when in Facebook you click that show this content only to my friends, it means that Facebook would only provide access to it to your friends. But in a decentralized system, you cannot do that. Everything is out there, but it's encrypted, and read access means that you can actually decrypt it. And write access is even trickier, because write access in practice actually means that you have the rights to update the root hash in some on-chain or off-chain registry. Typically, this means ENS. So once you own the ENS name for your Swarm site, then you have the ability to update the root reference for that. But if you want to create some complicated access control system which gives multiple parties write access, then you need to encode it in the smart contract that governs that particular ENS name's resolver. So the write access control is with the resolver, and the read access control is in Swarm with Swarm encryption. And there are basically three access control strategies in Swarm. They are listed on this slide in the increasing level of sophistication. The least sophisticated, but also the simplest access control is using a passphrase. Anybody who has the passphrase can read that particular content. This is very simple, very easy to understand, but it also has a very important drawback, namely that in order to give somebody the permission, you also need to have that. You need to have that passphrase, which means that you automatically has access to everything that that same identity has access to with other publishers. So if as a publisher you need to give somebody access, somebody read access through a passphrase, you need to know that passphrase. And in order to overcome that limitation, because it's a fairly severe limitation, the next level of sophistication is public keys. So you can encrypt certain swarm content to a particular public key, and the owner of the corresponding private key will be able to decrypt it. Now, this is better in that sense that even if you know the public key, you don't know the private key, so you cannot access whatever has been made available to the same public key by other publishers. But it still has a drawback, namely that if you have some content that is made available to a certain public key and you need to change the permissions, you would need to re-encrypt large parts of it. So to solve that kind of problem, we have the most sophisticated access control mechanism already built into Swarm, which is the ACTs, the access control tries. So this is the tree version of the ACLs, access control lists. And in this case, you have a set of undisclosed parties. Some of them can be password-based, others can be public key-based, and both of them can look up whether they have access to that particular content, but they cannot determine who else does. And actually what an ACT discloses is only a upper bound on how many parties can access that particular content, but it's an upper bound because many of the ACT entries can actually be fake. So you can stuff your ACT with some fake identities and not disclose how many subscribers you actually have. You can just provide an upper bound. So these are the properties that I talked about. So an ACT is referenced also by a swarm reference. So it is a swarm object, just like files or directories or collections. So it's no different in that respect. You can use the same ACT for access control for different content. So you can reuse the ACTs multiple times. And also it's been a very important design goal that we managed to fulfill, that the usual operations of changing access permissions do not require ever the re-encryption of large amounts of data. So whether you're granting access or retracting access to various parties, you just need to re-encrypt a little bit of data, basically keys, and you will immediately you will have immediately changed the ACT. And when you're publishing new content encrypted with that ACT, only those who have access according to the new ACT will have access to the new content. Of course, they will still have access to the old content because they have the old keys, so you cannot make somebody forget things, which in a decentralized system is a given. You cannot work around that. And even in centralized systems, if you remove the access control for some picture, it doesn't mean that somebody hasn't saved it for them. So you cannot unpublish things. That's simply impossible. but you can stop paying for it being made available, and that way the network will slowly but surely garbage collect that data. So the swarm does forget, but you cannot count on it. Very important. So this has a separate slide. Please take note of it. Access-controlled content can only be accessed on your local swarm node. You cannot do it with public gateways. Reason being that if you could, then the public gateways could spy on you. So if you want to access encrypted swarm content, run your own swarm node. Hopefully, when Swarm gets sufficiently mature, it will be integrated. Light Swarm nodes will be integrated into Web3-enabled browsers. As an experimental feature, most Web3-enabled browsers already support Swarm, so you can already play with it. But the vision is that every Web3-enabled browser will double as a Swarm node. So you will actually access Swarm content and decrypt it locally. So Swarm is an end-to-end encryption from the publisher to the consumer. So PSS, that's the postal service over Swarm, which reuses the routing of Swarm. And it kind of lets you decide on the trade-off between darkness or security or secrecy and efficiency. So obviously, Ethereum already has a secure messaging system, which is Whisper, which kind of maxes out the darkness component. And because of that, it has some performance issues. But that's the price that you pay for complete darkness. But sometimes some distributed applications might not want to go all the way in darkness, but they would like to be more efficient. So you cannot stream video over Whisper, but you can stream video over PSS at the expense of not being entirely anonymous, both on the receiver and the sender side. And depending on where you put that sliding control, the anonymity set can be bigger or smaller. So basically, it still provides you with end-to-end encryption, so we do not compromise on that. It has single-use session keys, which have forward secrecy. And it provides you with protocol encapsulation. So you can actually channel any protocol through PSS, meaning that you can have special protocol handlers, and it can be basically your transport layer. Let's skip this one. Swarm feeds. Swarm feeds are published on Swarm, and they are stored by Swarm nodes, meaning that unlike in PSS, the senders and the recipients of the data stored in Swarm feeds do not necessarily need to be online at the same time. So with Swarm feeds, you can actually publish feeds of data. That's what they are. And in order to post an update to your Swarm feed, you need two things. You need the private key to sign your update, and you need a topic. So once you have the topic and the private key, you can update your Swarm feed. And in order to read the Swarm feed, you need the Ethereum address of the publisher, and you also need the topic. So once you have the topic and the Ethereum address, you can access the Swarm feed, and you can even go back in time and you can see the entire history of that particular feed. provided that if somebody paid for its storage, so it's not it does not come with an automatic guarantee of availability. We don't, Swarm feeds do not give you that, but Swarm in the future will have that, and it's not even necessarily needed for all applications. So for example, imagine that you have a blog, and your subscribers who are interested in reading your blog also double as custodians, and they keep your content available, meaning that in this kind of arrangement, you are not subject to deplatforming. As long as you have loyal subscribers, your content is also available. I will talk about it in the next talk, so please come to that talk as well. So you can publish updates to ENS, so Swarm feeds can be the present state or the most recent state of the Swarm feed can be anchored in ENS on the Ethereum blockchain. So that's our version of eventual consistency. There's asynchronous pull messaging, and actually Swarm feeds are so performant that you can use them for IoT data feeds. So even though you can publish every update to the blockchain, you don't have to. And if you don't, then you can actually have massive amounts of data collected from, sensor arrays or home appliances or whatever. So that's where we are right now, and our roadmap is the following. So this year, we would like to provide a stable testnet. So those of you who have some experience playing with Swarm testnet know that it's been a little bit flaky, to put it diplomatically. So we would like to rectify that and have a very stable testnet this year, hopefully within a few months. We will have temporary file sending in production, so you will be able to send large files over Swarm. So basically, somebody uploads the file, sends over the handle to the recipient downloads the file. So that's a use case that we would like to be production stable this year. Reliable bandwidth accounting. So that is swap, that's how we call it. And that means that by sharing your bandwidth, you can earn, and by using bandwidth without actually contributing, you will need to pay. And combining the two means that in order to use Swarm, you can pay for it in kind, basically making your bandwidth available. So as long as you have enough bandwidth, you can use Swarm for free, meaning that you pay for your Swarm usage by letting others use your bandwidth as well. And one of the things that we would also like to achieve this year, to have the entire Ethereum state available through Swarm. Because eventually, if Swarm fulfills its mission as a scalable, available storage system, we would like to actually be the storage and availability layer for Ethereum blockchain itself. And that not only means Ethereum 1 as it is right now, but also the scalable sharded Ethereum 2. So just to summarize, Swarm is currently an experimental alpha stage project, but we already have example applications. We already have a testnet. We are hoping to improve stability big time very soon. We have fixed a large number of bugs. We have grown the team. We have a wonderful ecosystem by many companies listed here, contributing developers, code, publicity, money. So thank you. So for everybody on this slide, huge thank you from the Swarm team. You were great. Thank you so much for your support. And thank you for all of you for listening. And if you have any questions, you can ask them from me right now, or here are the ways to contact us, and other members of the Sworn team will also be happy to answer your question. Thank you so much.